Willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. This is the second in my DBN series of videos, and this will cover close combat, or combat where opposing elements are touching each other. Only the original close combat system will be covered in this video. The attrition system will most likely be covered in subsequent videos. The rules references will be visible in each slide. The rules reference uses a version 2019 of the rules. In some cases I have needed to go back to the original DBA rules for my references and examples. This video is based on my examples PDF document, which is a book which provides a large number of examples of play. This file can be found on the IO Group's Glitchbuild site. The link is at the end and in the description of this video. This version of the example files uses the 2019 version of the rules. This video series is not designed for experienced players, thus the primary audience are those not familiar with the rules, particularly DBA. As a result, some of the nomenclature used in this video will not be commonly used in the standard rules, but would be more understandable to someone from outside of the tent. The main changes are that I'll be using centimetres, assuming you're using 15mm figures instead of the word paces. I'll be using the word element instead of the word unit, and I'll be using the word turn instead of the word bound, specifically for player turn, and of course this will also include a game turn. In simple terms, a combat represents two opposing elements facing off against each other. This can be supported by friendly elements, but it's primarily a one-on-one affair. Both elements spin a d6, apply factors and modifiers, and compare the results, which determines the result of the combat. This applies for both fire and close combat. Close combat represents two elements engaged in, you guessed it, close combat. This is a combination of close range shooting and melee. In the first half of the videos, I'll be covering how to initiate close combat. Incidentally, I've reversed the order and inserted close combat before fire combat. This may not be thematically correct, but as close combat is simpler, it's more logical to start here so people are prepared for fire combat. In order to initiate close combat, the attacking element must be able to make contact with at least 50% of its front edge. If unable to wheel or move sideways to achieve this, then close combat is not permitted. In this case, the attacking element is at its maximum move distance, so is unable to wheel or conduct a sideward move to allow it to achieve contact. Thus, it cannot engage in close combat. Contact can be made against any edge, but it must be fully against the edge, whether it's the front, side or rear. Contact across a corner is not acceptable. If the attacker has sufficient movement, it would wheel to achieve a full edge contact, but it lacks this, so no close combat is allowed, thus it cannot engage in close combat. An infantry element may not move into contact with any mounted element except as close combat support for a friendly element that is either in or has moved into contact in that player turn. In this example, the line infantry element cannot engage in close combat. In this example, the French dragoon element has moved into contact with the Landwehr cavalry element. The French musketeer element can then move up to provide support, and close combat can occur with the support of the musketeer element. An attack column is a column formation of at least two elements, with the rear element providing support and a combat bonus to the front element. Only infantry can conduct attack column. Both elements in the attack column must be of the same nationality, but may be of different classes. However, the lowest class of unmodified combat factor is used. Example, an attack column composing of an element of musketeers and an element of militia musketeers has a basic combat factor of +3. Basically, it uses the militia value. Whether if it is mixed with an elite musketeer and a normal musketeer, then the factor would be +4, which is the standard musketeer factor. Always use the lowest class in an attack column. While an attack column provides combat advantages, there are some disadvantages. That is, if the attack column suffers an eliminated result, then both elements are affected. Showing an example of close combat support, in this case the French element is engaged in close combat with the Prussian element directly to its front, but it also has further enemy elements to its right and left, and thus is outflanked twice and suffers a -1 to its combat factor for each outflanking element. These flanking elements are deemed to be providing close combat support, and as such cannot be fired upon by the attacker. There are a number of restrictions associated with providing close combat support. In close combat, to be supported, no part of the base front edge of a supporting element is to pass the front edge of the combating enemy element unless in full, clear front edge contact. In this case, both flanking elements are not providing support. It's very important to line everything up very carefully. This shows invalid and valid close combat supporting elements. It comes from the standard rules. As you can see, there are only two cases here which are valid and provides close combat support. Cavalry or mounted have a special benefit when they're attacked in the flank. Any attacked, unshaken unit of mounted can immediately turn to face if the attacker has moved more than 5 centimeters in sight before making contact. All other units cannot immediately turn to face. In this case, the cavalry can face the dragoons because the dragoons moved 5 centimeters. Note, infantry cannot conduct close combat against mounted. The ability to turn to face to meet an enemy that hits it in the flank is one that only cavalry or mounted possess, unless the move to contact it in the flank was less than 5 centimeters. In this particular case, the ulan is contacted in the flank, and the move, in order to achieve this, was less than 5 centimeters, so it cannot turn to face. However, if the attacked element loses the combat, and it's contacted in the flank and it remains in this particular manner, then it turns to face after the loss, if not already obviously, and recalls. If it cannot recall, then it's destroyed. Note, infantry cannot conduct close combat against mounted. When an element contacts an attack column or any other column in the flank, there are a number of specific rules associated with which elements are actually conducting close combat. In this particular example, if the column is attacked on the right flank, the attacking element must align its right-hand edge with the chosen opponent's front right edge. During the width of its base, the attacker may be in contact with two enemy elements, but only the front hand element is deemed to be the one under attack, which is the top one. And the second element behind is not classed as providing close combat support in this particular case. This shows an example of an element contacting a column on its left flank. In this particular case, cavalry against cavalry. Quick note, the attacker, which is on the left, its left corner must align with the left corner of the front element in order to conduct combat or close combat with it. It is only conducting close combat with the element that it is in corner-to-corner contact. The rear ulan element is not involved in the combat, although it may suffer the results of the combat. Note, infantry cannot conduct close combat against mounted. See case 821. In the second half of the video, we'll be going through the actual combat procedure. Just a reminder, this is the original DBN version 1 combat system and is not the attrition combat system. Close combat requires both elements, obviously, to be in base-to-base contact in order to conduct combat or close combat. The combat procedure is described in case 8.2 as seen here in green. The DBA version 1 and DBA version 3 combat procedure is described in the blue boxes. For players of DBA, this is second nature and hardly required, but for new players, this rule is critical in understanding how the combat process works. I must admit, I spent a lot of effort reading through the rules in an attempt to find it, which I eventually did. I am uncertain why I had so many issues, but in case other new players had the same issue, I thought I would duplicate this rule in this particular slide so it's clear for all to see and understand and also to locate. The close combat process requires both sides to spin a d6 and then individually add the close combat factor and close combat tactical factors all together to arrive at a single number. The totals are then compared to determine the result. Going through this in more detail, both players spin a d6 dice and notes the result. Then each player adds the fire combat factor. This requires you to cross-reference the element type with the target, which could be foot or mounted, to arrive at the close combat factor. In this case, muskets against foot have a fire combat factor of +4. Then we apply the fire combat tactical factor or modifier. Both players then go through the list and either subtracts or add the fire combat tactical factor to their final result. For example, if one side is elite, it adds +1 to its total. We now have two values, one for each side, and we compare the values together. If the values are equal, it's a draw, which results in mounted recoiling otherwise and nothing else occurring. If one value is greater than the other, then the element with the lesser value is considered to be beaten. If an element is beaten, which of course means its score is less than its opponent, it's in combat, but not by double. The element is normally forced to recoil, or in some cases destroyed. If an element is beaten, which of course means its score is less than its opponent, in combat by double or more, the element is normally eliminated or severely affected. In this example, we have a French musketeer engaged in close combat against the Prussian. It's the French player term, which means it's the French player launching the attack, or unless the close combat is a carryover from the previous player phase. The French musket versus foot has an FCF of 4, which actually is the same as its fire combat FCF. In most cases, the fire combat factors, whether it's direct fire or close combat, is the same, but it is different in some cases. It spins a 5, there are no modifiers, which means the French get a 9, the Prussian spins a 2, FCF of 4, gets a 6. The French wins 8 to 6 or 1.5 to 1, which means the Prussian recoils back from close combat. The close combat has ended. This shows an example of an element being eliminated. The French musket spins a 1, which means its result is 5. The Prussian musket spins a 6, which means its result is 10. The Prussian wins 10 to 5 or 2 to 1. The French element is eliminated, which is a bad result for the French. A common modifier is close support. Friendly elements can provide close combat support, and this shows an example of it. What we see here is the French against a Prussian element. The Prussians gain a single element which can provide close support, and that affects the French total. So let's go through in more detail. The French musket versus foot, it has an FCF of 4, it spins a 3. The modifiers are element providing close support, which reduces it by 1, which means its final total is 6. The Prussian musket versus foot has an FCF of 4, it spins a 3, there are no modifiers, its result is 7. The Prussian wins 7 to 6 or 1.2 to 1. The French recoils. This shows another example of close support. In this particular case, one element is contacting the French directly in the flank. Now, just a quick note, if the flank contact occurred before the front face contact, then the Prussian would gain a +1 because it was combating the French in the flank, which is a good thing. So the Prussian would probably attempt to try and do the flank before the frontal attack. However, in most cases that will not be the case, because what normally occurs is the front attack is used to pin the enemy, and then another element can swing around to hit it in the flank, which really means that it doesn't get the +1 support, but as we'll see at the end of the combat, it gives you another advantage. Let's go through this combat in more detail. The French musket versus foot has an FCF of 4, it spins a 3. The modifier, enemy providing close support -1, its result is 6, similar as before. The Prussian musket versus foot, it has an FCF of 4, it spins a 3, it has no modifier, result of 7. The Prussian wins 7 to 6 or 1.2 to 1. The French recoils, but it's not allowed to recoil across an enemy element's front, and as a result, it's eliminated. This concludes my Part 2 DBN training video, in this case providing an overview of the close combat mechanics. This video is an overview video rather than an in-depth view of a game activity. As is my normal practice with other rules, I will probably create a deep dive video showing the close combat process in a lot more detail later, based on how useful I think it would be. I can see an opportunity to cover all the tactical factors or modifiers in a lot more detail, as it may be unclear to some players what some of the modifiers are and when do they apply. I'll be covering combat results in also a later overview video, as this could easily fill an entire video. As indicated at the beginning, this video is based on my examples, a book for DBN, which can be found in the Kriegspiel.io group site. Just go to the File section, Napoleonic Rules folder, and select DBN. You will find it. Denken Sie daran, immer für Heimat zu kämpfen.